All right. Welcome, everyone. We're live streaming this just so that everyone knows. This is the first ever broadcast of the Open Protocol discussion, which is a bi-weekly meeting in which we discuss and plan for upcoming changes in and improvements to the Stellar protocol. Generally, these meetings are to review core advancement proposals, also known as CAPs, which suggest new features and improvements to the protocol. Sometimes we also talk about the process for protocol improvement, and we're going to do a little of both in this meeting. First, we'll talk about 2 CAPs and 1 issue that outline proposed changes. Those are all for possible inclusion in Protocol 14. And then we'll cover an issue that relates to the process for the creation of CAPs. Finally, I'll just touch a little bit on the process for orchestrating network upgrades because we've learned a lot upgrading to Protocol 13, which has yet to happen. So we've published some pre-reading requirements for this meeting. They're in the event description, so if you're following along, you may want to look at those so that you can keep up. And there's also an outline of the agenda on the left of the screen, I believe. And without further ado, I guess we'll just jump in. I wanted to start this out with a Protocol 13 update, so that's the first agenda item. Basically, after surveying the ecosystem, we decided to push the upgrade vote 2 weeks. It's supposed to be today. Now it's going to be June 18th to give people more time to prepare. Basically, most of the Stellar-based businesses that we talk to are ready right now, but several crypto exchanges aren't, and we just wanted to give them a little bit more time so they don't break. So that's the Protocol 13 update news. Any questions? Okay, cool. The next 2 things that we have to talk about are CAPs that are potential inclusion in Protocol 14. The first is CAP 23, 2-part payments. It's been around for a while. We've had a lot of discussions about it. The current version is pared down from where it started. Basically, it creates a new ledger entry called a claimable balance and 2 new operations that allow you to create and claim a claimable balance. The idea is to be able to separate sending and receiving of a payment so that you can send a payment to an account that isn't prepared to receive it. CAP 23, is there anything else that, I mean, we talked about this a lot. Is there more discussion that needs to happen about this? Does anyone have any questions, comments? Jonathan, Jove, do you feel like you've gotten the feedback you need?
I think we're ready to go. I think the only outstanding thing here is that doing what we decided 2 weeks ago, or whatever the last time we met was, I think 2 weeks ago, where this isn't in the proposal yet, but instead of trying to send funds back to, basically instead of like trying to do this thing where it's like, oh, you try to send the funds back to the creator, but if you fail, you send them to the recipient. We're not going to do that anymore, as we decided. It's not reflected in the proposal yet, and instead we're just going to, unreturnable funds go to the fee pool, basically. We're already working on that in the implementation, but the proposal hasn't been updated yet, so I just wanted to mention that. But everything else is as we agreed.
I have a question. The question is, if it wasn't clear to me reading the proposal, if the account that's the created by, or with CAP 33 becomes the sponsor, do they always have the possibility of claiming back the claimable balance, or does the creating account need to add themselves as a claimant to be able to claim it back?
So the creating account doesn't have any special privileges relative to any other account. It was only there for this bookkeeping about returning the reserve, but it's not special in any other way. If we took the approach of like always destroy the reserve, then we wouldn't even have that information there. One thing I will mention is like we're not like that created by field isn't going to exist anymore. Like the CAP 33 functionality is going to supplant it. So there won't even be, it won't even be there anymore. It won't look special anymore relative to any of the other sponsorship things. But no, there's nothing special about it.
Does that answer your question, Lee?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so if there are no other questions, the plan here is that I'm going to, the people who are eligible to vote on moving this into final comment period will email me by the end of the day tomorrow. And if they agree to move this into final comment period, we'll post on the mailing list, get final comments from anyone out there in the community, and go from there. Sound good? Cool. Next on the agenda, CAP 33, also for potential inclusion in Protocol 14. Sponsored reserves. This proposal allows an entity to cover the reserve for accounts controlled by another party without giving that other party control to the reserve. It basically extends account and ledger entries so they record pertinent information about sponsorships, creates new operations to initiate and terminate sponsorship, and update sponsorship information for existing ledger entries. So the goal is to allow people like asset issuers and wallets to cover the reserves for users. This one landed more recently. And so I guess my first question is, does anyone have any comments, questions, or suggestions about the sort of recent version of this that Jonathan turned in?
I had a question. In order to use this stuff, you have to have creation of the sponsorship happens by one account, and then there's a closing out that happens by the other account, right? To make sure that this thing is sandwiched properly, things you're not supposed to authorize. The question is, how does it work in like a workflow, a kind of vibrant like workflow to create these accounts? I was struggling to kind of see in my head what the path was, because you have to get the two accounts to coordinate with each other. Do we have an example of that somewhere? Or could somebody talk me through it?
I'm not sure if I should answer this or if Lee should answer this. Lee might also have more context on this than me. So if you feel comfortable taking this one, Lee, I would appreciate that, but otherwise I will do it.
Yeah, I can talk about it. I actually also have a question about this and a concern about this specifically in the situation that Eric brought up about creating accounts. But yeah, so I think if it was to work how it's written in the proposal, a client and a server would have to be negotiating. So the client's going to make some initial hello that starts off the process. The server's going to create the transaction, assign an account that can use that sequence number for the duration of this whole handshake. The transaction is going to have to be signed by them, passed back to the client, signed, and then submitted. So there is like this back and forth negotiation that has to happen. The server or the service that's creating the account and sponsoring it can't do it on its own. Does that answer your question, Eric?
Yeah, I guess so. Although I start having more questions then, like what happens if the account doesn't exist to sign it?
So do you think it would make sense to explain this in a non-normative section of the document?
I think we actually need a SEP for this, and it's very analogous to what SEP 8 is to CAP 18. Basically, how do you actually do the negotiation off chain and then before you submit it to the network? So I think that Lee, because you guys are going to be probably one of the first implementers of this, it would be great to have you guys figure out what makes sense to you and then inform the rest of the ecosystem or ask for comments.
Yeah, so I think, so I actually have a concern with this. So my understanding of why we have that second, that last transaction, so that last operation to confirm and close it out is because we see value in the account that's being sponsored, confirming that they actually are okay with being sponsored. I think a problem with that, so I think that works for a lot of cases where the account being sponsored can be the account where the sequence number is coming from. But for the create account operation, I think this is going to be really difficult at scale because the service, the sponsor, is going to have to lock up an account with a sequence number during that process of that negotiation. And I think that's going to be problematic enough that that could prevent this from scaling. And we really want this to work, sponsorship to work at a significant scale, because it's primarily for an enterprise that's going to be sponsoring lots of accounts. So I'm wondering if we're putting too much value on what this solves, on the problem that this solves, and if this will create a larger problem.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's definitely like this is not the only sequence number provision problem in the world of Stellar for sure. And I think given the fee bump improvements that are coming in Protocol 13, this is kind of a step backwards in that regard for this particular issue. I am a pretty strong believer that there are a lot of advantages to making this like double signature requirement. I mean, like, I think we're going to be here for months otherwise, just in the sense of like me going through and just like making sure that everything is still going to work and doing sanity checks on everything, and because it weakens the backwards compatibility constraints a lot. That being said, like David was at our last meeting talking about, I think he actually sent an email about this, which I'm going to confess to not having read as closely as I should have.
Read it. It's on the Stellar Def mailing list. I can post a link to it somewhere else if you want.
Yeah, I'll review it after this now because it's seeming more relevant. And I want to just start by saying, like, whatever I'm about to say is like definitely not going to happen in Protocol 14 no matter what, because there's no time. But like as a longer term solution, like providing some other kind of mechanism to avoid this need to, manage sequence numbers for all sorts of random stuff, that could be the long-term solution to this kind of problem. Using something like a hash preimage or something else that to do it might. I think that's like that was the concept, right, David? Like some other kind of authorization thing.
Well, actually, it was basically saying that you can sign an operation. And then you don't have to sign the transaction. Someone can use the transaction. Someone can include that operation in a transaction, and it will not increase the signature requirements on the transaction envelope.
Oh, so that would allow you to sign the transaction envelope at a later time, basically, once you've already like at a time when you can choose the sequence number, right?
Like basically, let's say I want to allow you to add a particular trust line to my account, or I want to allow you to authorize a particular trust line on an account. I can just sign that one operation and give it to you, and you can include that operation in whatever transaction you want.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting idea that would mitigate this problem. I mean, I'm kind of like backing out on this basically, and like I don't have a good way to avoid this problem today, given this design. And my stance is kind of like the merits of this design warrant searching for another way to avoid this problem, which is like a general purpose Stellar problem anyway. Trying to solve it for this specific issue isn't going to solve it for some future issue where we're going to encounter the exact same thing and then need to engineer some solution for that as well.
And to be clear, the problem arises specifically with the create account operation, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it specifically arises there just because the sequence number is being locked up by another party. So most of the time when you're creating accounts right now, it's not as such an issue because the service locks up the sequence number for the time it needs it to be locked up for. But this is going to be locked up for the time it requires two parties to negotiate.
Yeah, I mean, like one approach you could kind of take is basically the stance that like you need to do, basically you set some time limit on how long this negotiation can take, this off-chain communication. You say like basically like, hey, I'm going to let you take like up to 1 minute to sort this out with my server, and otherwise you have to like reinitiate this with me at some later time. And in that time, again, you'll have 1 minute. And then this could allow you to use like a small pool of accounts. You only need to maintain 1 minute's worth of accounts basically to use as sequence numbers. Obviously, it's not amazing solution. It's not elegant. It comes back to the channel problem again.
That's a lot of accounts. Like a minute's worth of accounts for a high throughput service is a lot of accounts.
Agreed.
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, signups are typically a very small fraction of what happens on a service. And so that's, I think, when you do create account. I guess maybe you do create account during escrow operations as well. So that might make it trickier. But I don't know. My take is like you're probably going to have to build a channel system anyway with things the way they are. And so sure, this maybe means that you need 100 channel accounts rather than 10, but it's not really fundamentally changing the situation. Maybe that's overly optimistic. I don't know.
Yeah, I think where I can see the challenge is just in like typically, at least how I know like we have implemented this before, is you take a channel account, you lock it for some predefined operation that you're going to run in code. So it just becomes more complex to say, okay, I'm going to lock that based off someone else's actions and or some timeout. But yeah, I agree. It's just building on existing complexity, so it's not really new complexity.
Also, I think the timeouts are in the same order of magnitude, right? Like we're talking, a stellar transaction is typically valid for like, let's say, a minute. Don't imagine you would go, longer than that for those interactive things anyways. I mean, they're non-interactive. I mean, it's really just, basically passing this to the client signs it and, and all that. So it's probably the same thing. That's what I imagine.
I think this is a good opportunity for us at the SDF to put some open source example of how to actually achieve something like this in a fairly high throughput manner. And like John said, I think that this specific problem doesn't actually relate to CAP 33. It's more of a general Stellar problem. So maybe trying to solve for this right now is counterproductive.
I mean, on the other hand, it would be nice to at least commit to some way of solving it. Like if there's, if this is going to be a problem, and what we do is we approve CAP 33, and then followed by 6 months of discussing which of like our approaches should we take to solve this problem. That could be an issue.
I don't think so. I think they're orthogonal. Like we have to solve it in general. Like it's not just for that particular operation, right? Like you won't, even like CAP 18, you need some way of doing that efficiently. I guess CAP 18 maybe you don't need yeah.
Then maybe this should be
yeah,
discussed. Maybe there should be just a short non-normative section of the CAP that discusses the need for some kind of mechanism, and then subsequent CAPs can cite this. Will sort of provide ammunition to get whatever solution we come up with over the line later on.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I'll add that after this meeting or sometime later this week. Just a little discussion about how this is like, it's an annoying source of complexity. It's probably worth it nonetheless. And it's just a manifestation of a bigger problem that we're fighting all the time.
And then the plan would be to create some sort of group to solve this larger problem, like a working group. But from what I understand, this CAP 33, it could move on to final comment period, because it seems like there's not a way to do it that doesn't encounter this larger issue. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, my stance would be like, if you avoid this issue, you'll find a different, like we'll find the other issues that were problems with CAP 31, which we rejected in favor of this. So it's like, you can't avoid both sets of problems. You have to pick which one you want. I pick this set of problems only from the perspective that like they're problems that are general purpose manifestations, not single purpose. And I think that the other benefits are better on top of that.
But John, you think you can add this language before final comment period?
Yeah, I mean, like, we make modifications to these during implementation also, and then we go into the implementation period. So yeah, I mean, I'll add the language, and it'll be there during the final comment period for sure.
So you'll add it, and then we'll vote, or
Sure.
How does? Okay,
Yeah.
that's fine.
When John's added it, I'll submit it to eligible parties to vote on, and then we can see. And if basically if people are like, no, we don't think it's ready, we can bring it back in the next meeting. But if people look at it and decide that it is, we can go ahead and vote it into final comment period and open it up for final comments. Cool.
I had one other question. Other operations, you said other operations with slated semantics in order to behave correctly. This proposal. The sentence that might include.
Sorry, I'm having a little trouble hearing you, Eric. Can you say that one more time?
Yeah, the other operations need updated semantics in order to behave correctly. Can you just give like a high-level view of what that might include? Is that something we need to worry about?
It's not something that we need to worry about. Well, it's something that I'm already worrying about. I'm working on it. I was working on it right before this meeting, actually. But basically, what kind of needs to be done is like everywhere where we do like where we change the like account.num subentries field, we now need to do it. We now need additional logic to say like, hey, like, was there a sponsor? Oh, if there wasn't, then do what we used to do. If there was, then we have to do all this other stuff like, oh, like check that the sponsoring account still exists. It doesn't have to still exist, for example. So like that's a new failure mode. I haven't worked out the precise details on this because it like I need to kind of go to the implementation and see what's going to work. And that's why it's kind of very nebulous in the proposal. But the kind of consequences here are going to be like potentially a few new failure modes that are only possible with sponsorships, and basically just new code for me to write. But every other perspective, everything will kind of just like work the same. Like when create account works, it'll just work, and you won't really be able to tell the difference other than some sponsorship information will have changed.
Okay, so it sounds like most of this is internal to the implementation, but we might see some new error codes.
Yeah, and like that, those kinds of changes are where like we have the ledger entry extension v1 and the account entry extension v2. Those changes are where those things will be maintained. So you know that's pretty much what it comes down to.
Okay.
Is there anything else that anyone wants to talk about in relation to CAP 33? Or I feel like the plan right now is John gets back to work, adds this extra session, we send it out, and see if it gets voted in final comment period. But I don't want to close it if there's still questions.
Just want to say that it's a great CAP, John. Much better than CAP 31, I think. I really like the whole moving things to the off-chain logic. Really good
Thanks,
stuff.
Summer. I appreciate that.
Great. Well, then we will move on to the next item on the agenda. That's issue 622, which is about changing the application of close time. Basically, it changes the close time for a transaction, so it's set for the ledger after the transaction gets applied, because right now when applying transactions, we use the close time decided during consensus, and that can create issues if a transaction gets accepted but into a ledger but fails later. I think this is just an optimization. Does anyone have any issues with it? Does it feel like something that should be worked on for Protocol 14?
Yeah, it's an annoyance basically for smart contracts, and we are kind of cleaning up those things over time. This is a small item, so that's why we're considering it.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I understand the issue. Right now, who decides the time that's evaluated against time bounds?
It is not about deciding the time. This is about how we reason about the time from a transaction validity point of view.
Because of time bounds.
Right.
Okay. And
so you time bounds are, you know, we compare it to some time, right?
Right.
And right now we use the time that was decided during the consensus round.
Right.
And this is wrong.
And so what time are you proposing to use?
To use the time from the previous ledger. Because the time from the previous ledger was already decided when you were checking for validity of the transactions when they were submitted.
I mean, this seems somewhat dangerous. This means like if there's an outage, it's possible that we could apply a transaction that's like an hour old or something.
Yeah, yes. And the close time may also jump by an hour. Right. So there's no, like we have to decide. I mean, this is not a, you know, that's just the way you have to make a trade-off. You know, what happens if you have an outage? Which transactions do you want to reject, I guess?
That's a pretty good point, David.
So like, let's say that like we have an option where I have a transaction that I can submit that will trade X for Y or something, right? And since I don't know the value of X and Y in an hour, you know, like we agreed on this now. So now I could theoretically, you know, DOS the network and get like a free option to, you know, basically make my decision with an extra hour's worth of information. I mean, obviously, it's not
I
that
mean,
easy to dodge
the alternative is, and that's a lot harder, is to remove those transactions from the transaction set. And the thing is that we cannot do that right now. We have no way of doing this. Right? Consensus is still running. Like, you can't change the transaction set.
I mean, I do see other ways of doing this, and I haven't thought deeply about this, but just so another thing you could do is, for example, when you nominate a transaction set, it could have some expiration time or something, and then
but that's not just okay.
Based on, or you could kind of like.
I'm not sure what you're saying. So are you saying that you would have look at validity based on like some heuristic on the timestamp or something?
Well, and I'm saying, like, currently we sort of take the largest transaction set when we're sort of combining multiple nominated values, and now maybe we could take the largest transaction set, or the transaction set with like the most number of unexpired transactions or something.
But you still end up with some expired transactions, right? That's the issue here, is that those guys, what do you do with them? Because basically, I guess the reason we have this problem is the close time and transaction set are kind of decided separately.
Could we modify our validity checks to, like, I'm specifically thinking about David's like 1 hour window thing that he was talking about. So this is still under the assumption that we're going to make the change described in 622. But could we modify the validity check such that you won't vote for anything if you're not Byzantine that isn't, basically it's like transactions time bounds are checked both using the last close time and the current time? Because then it's like you wouldn't vote for something from an hour ago because it wouldn't have been valid using your current timestamp. It has to meet both conditions to work. This isn't a protocol level change. It's a nomination.
But that if you do that, you only reduce the chance of having a bad timestamp. You don't eliminate it.
And so the main, I mean, is the main issue here just that we have garbage in the set of transactions that we can't charge a fee for?
Yeah. So right now, no, it's not garbage. I mean, it's more like that we end up with transactions that are accepted for during consensus, but because they are now evaluated against a different timestamp than the one from when they were nominated, they now become invalid. So now you have like those smart contracts potentially getting dust, right? Where if I because they are valid when consensus starts and they're now invalid during consensus. And yeah, they're failed transactions, and they will consume the sequence number. And now maybe that smart contract is dead because
wait, they don't consume the sequence number because
that's consensus.
That's what the bug is with 622. That's what the core of the problem is, because we have the invariant that anything that gets into the ledger, we're going to guarantee we're going to take the fee and we're going to take the sequence number. And so that's the thing that Nicolas wants to combat here is, getting your smart contract broken by one of these like boundary case timestamps.
Well, this is another way to solve this would be, say, authenticated operations. So I feel like there are other things that
no. Why are you saying that? No, how is this has nothing to do with authenticated operations? This is timestamps.
Well, the authenticated operations gets rid of the problem of consuming sequence numbers. Part of the problem here is how brittle a lot of these protocols are because of like sequence numbers, right?
Well,
and so
no, here the issue is that timestamps don't work, right? So, like you're saying, like, yes, you could fix certain smart contracts by using like those, those new, like basically use a different sequence number basically from a different account. You offload the sequence number to some live account basically. But here that's not what we're talking about. We are talking about sequence numbers in general. Like today we do see once in a while ledgers with failed time bounds in the set of failed transactions.
Right, I understand, but I'm saying that that one of the arguments in favor of this is that right now there are annoying situations that break certain protocols because a sequence number gets consumed by a transaction with an invalid time bounds. And I'm saying that, well, because of CAP 33, we've already said there's a need for something, and one of the ways to do that something would be the authenticated transaction, or the authenticated operations. Not saying that that's the right solution, but it just so happens that authenticated operations also solve this problem of
it cannot solve it, right? Like you're saying that no smart contract would ever rely on a time bound or something. Like it seems to me that
saying
if
that
failures,
I'm saying
like
that
Yeah,
I'm saying that no smart contract, that ideally smart contracts would not rely on sequence numbers in a way that breaks if the sequence number gets consumed by an invalid transaction.
That doesn't sound that plausible to me, actually, because
you
there
can't
are
change
some
transactions if you do that.
Right. Not only that, but you can't do the bump sequence trick without that. And so
you can, because of the way I mean, at least though I'm not saying that this is the right answer, but it's an existence proof that you can do this, right? Because of the way that because the authenticated operations can depend on there being some other operation in the transaction. That other operation can be a bump sequence, right?
But what about existing smart contracts? Like, what about ones who already have this problem?
Then they'll have a different problem if we do 622.
No.
Like,
the only reason you would have a problem is the DOS situation. If you have like those funny time windows, normally it's more like starting from a certain date, this is valid. Expiration, if you have an expiration and you dot right around the expiration time, I can see that this is a problem regardless, right? This is not a solved thing, like where you basically rely on the fact that the network has a semi-accurate time, right? But in the event of a dot, it's not accurate. It's going to be off by some number.
Look, I think that, there's a problem here. I think that if you were to write up like a requirements list, my suspicion is that I could, propose some alternative that doesn't look like the proposal here. Whether that's better or not, I don't know, but I think it would probably be worth considering multiple approaches based on a kind of a specific kind of like a slightly more detailed description of the problem and like what we're trying to achieve.
Does anyone object to taking that course, basically writing up a requirements list and giving David an opportunity to come up with an alternative solution?
That's fine.
It doesn't have to be like, I'm not trying to create a lot of make work here. Like it could just be, a couple simple examples of what we're trying to, scenarios that where we're trying to avoid a problem. But
I think honestly that it'd be good to think about it a little more, just from the perspective that like I want to try to understand that DOS scenario well. Like, is it a problem or does it just sound like a problem? I'm not sure that it's actually a problem, but I'm also not sure that it's actually not a problem.
It's a big existential question.
So like, I think it's worth looking at least a little deeper about this and making sure we know what we're doing.
I think we also talk about the dot type of scenarios quite a bit already on the mailing list, I think, because David had this other change to the time bounds you remember, David, like that was like what, a year ago at this point.
Oh, I don't remember.
I remember that.
We went back and forth on time bounds. That basically is what ended up being replaced by cap 23, I think. But in that proposal, you had some interesting new time bounds, right?
Well, it had like preconditions. I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
The
that's right.
preconditions one.
But there were some discussions around like those type of things, like what happens when you have like an attacker delays the network. You know, what type of properties we're trying to get here, and maybe the issue is that we don't fully right now, we don't have basically a written statement on what we expect smart contracts developers to do when you have those type of attacks. I think that's maybe just one of the other things that we need to think about here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, basically, I guess what I'm saying is before someone invests the time to like write a whole cap for this, let's just like get some requirements down and just, at a subsequent meeting, just talk through like whatever approaches people have and come up with an approach we think is like the best approach. Because there may be other approaches, maybe not, maybe I'm wrong, but
that seems like a great solution to me. Cool. Any other discussion about this? Are we ready to move on to the next item? Great. So the next item is issue 624, which is improve the CAP process. So it clarifies the role of working groups. Also attempts to take into account more information about the impact of proposed changes on downstream systems. Thoughts, questions, discussion that we want to have about this? I mean, I guess for me, it makes sense to better figure out how working groups create caps and who owns them and who participates in those groups. And I mean, this proposal made a lot of sense to me. And then I think it's just a question of starting to experiment with it and seeing if it works.
Right. Like maybe like as background, like when I wrote this stuff, like one of the things I also took into account is that in the current process that we have actually written in the protocols repo, it says that there is this, I don't know, mythical creature that participates into the CAP process. That's the buddy or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. The mythical buddy.
Right. That doesn't exist. So,
right.
And I basically, as I realize, and also, with the way we've been working more and more, it seems to me that that buddy was, concept was more or less a over engineering in a way from the process point of view in trying to take away, like room for the working group to actually figure out who are the best people to actually have in that working group. So I think, like, if we end up with like something more like what I'm highlighting in this issue, we would remove the buddy from the process.
Yeah, I mean, I just generally object to the word buddy. It just sounds, I just don't like the sound of it. Okay. But also, I think if it's something that we're not using, and it was the same thing that John brought up on this with the test section, right? Like, I guess that we need to just look at the actual, I guess it lives in the CAP README that defines the CAP process and make sure that it actually adheres to a process that we feel good about and that reflects what we've learned. But then I think we also need to be relying more strongly on working groups, right?
Yeah. And maybe like maybe this time we can. I saw that Eric had a question on like what does it mean to have the rest of the stack, like light up and all that. Like to me, the intent here is to have the working group think about the implications of that change in a more holistic manner. Basically, if we need, like very often, some of the changes are like, oh, we need a SEP. Basically, the SEP should be basically written in parallel with the CAP, by the working group. If that's the only way that thing can be used, because that's how we are going to find bugs in the CAP. Another thing on performance, because I think Eric or maybe Lee, I don't know. Somebody else asked about performance. I wanted people to think about performance implications in other systems as well. Like the working group should be thinking about, well, the CAP itself really talks about, the local performance impact. But at the same time, for example, one of the most painful changes in Protocol 13 was very surprising to me. It was the change to that fee column in Horizon.
Right, the table migration.
That takes like
10 hours.
12 hours or whatever. This is
right.
something, maybe we would have made some changes. I don't know, like like if we had identified this early on. So this is the kind of thing I'm trying to get to, is get sometimes changes look trivial, in the core layer, but the implications upstreams are just terrible. And I'm kind of want people to think about those type of implications early on, so that we can make adjustments.
And so basically, a working group would figure that stuff out, document it as part of the proposal, submit it to this group with all that documentation, so that all the research would be done. We'd know a little bit more what we were talking about. Yeah, and to me that sounds great. I mean, the only question that I have is a feasibility one, right? Like, if we had all the right people to staff any given working group that we wanted to create, this would work. I just wonder if in reality we're going to run up against issues where we just we want to have 3 working groups. We don't have 3 working groups of people with the necessary insight to fill those working groups. That's my only feasibility concern, if that makes sense.
I mean, we kind of
run into that problem already.
And yes, we do. And at the same time, my response is that if we don't have time to think about this, maybe we should not do it in that protocol version. If we can't basically do the due diligence that that goes with a specific change, that means we're not thinking about it.
Right. So I think that the additional lift here, which is reasonable, is to basically improve the process of putting together working groups. So it's improve what a working group does, define it better, add it to the CAP process, and then also get better at putting working groups together, which seems reasonable to me.
And my hope also, but that's maybe the chair on the top, would be if we have more of those kind of lively discussions at the working group level, they should become a bit more. Those conversations, I think, end up being a little more inclusive from an ecosystem point of view, because they're actually touching a lot more different parts. Right now, I think the issues with any thread on the dev mailing list that are protocol changes, they are so far removed from the actual developers that nobody can really chime in, right? They don't see how this is really impacting them, unless it's obvious. So my hope is that we can maybe get a little more feedback early on from the people that are going to use those things in the future.
If anyone's watching this right now and is I would love to be in a working group in the future, you should email me, justin@stellar.org. I think it's going to be about going out and collecting people, right? People with insight, people who are building stuff, and making sure that they understand the potential implications that one of these core changes have, and getting their insight, right?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I like the working group direction and being more inclusive of people on the Horizon team or SDK team, or even application developers. I think one other element that seemed pretty central to me that I didn't maybe I missed it, but I didn't really fully see it fleshed out in this this issue was kind of the contents of the CAP and having an explicit section of the CAP that discusses the changes that would be made to Horizon. So to Nico's point, saying, we're going to migrate this column in the database table. We're going to change the schema this way. We're going to add these endpoints. We're going to modify the Go SDK to have these new calls or deprecate this call. That seems pretty key to have as part of it and for understanding the downstream effects. And I didn't really see it articulated here.
Yeah, I mean, like the issue, by the way, like it was really to start the conversation. It's not the actual diff of what we're going to do on the on that README or whatever at the top level. I agree. I mean, I think at the same time, should the cap become more implementation focused? I don't know. Like I like that right now it's a little more at the spec level, like functional, and not so much at the too low into the details, right? And I think that if we have the right participants in that working group, the implementation kind of falls in place more in GitHub issues and so on, not in the actual doc. Like the actual doc is more like tracking like the high level, like does that even make sense, right, for all the systems involved?
And depending on the change, there may be a SEP that needs to essentially, certain caps don't make sense without an accompanying SEP. And so there's no point in like talking about, what database tables you're going to migrate in the cap when there's like an associated SEP.
I also agree that I think the cap is the wrong place for this kind of stuff. The cap is evolving as it's implemented. And then there's a point where it becomes reasonable to think about the details for downstream. But the high level details can be thought of separately and should be done in a working group. And I think most of the time there should be a SEP associated with the cap because something is motivating this work, right? And that should be the SEP.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to say, Eric. Like maybe we should have a new standard, which is like, we don't accept caps that don't have SEPs. And the SEPs might not be like hey, here's some, new auth protocol that, client server need to implement or something like that, new endpoints. It might just be like, hey, like Horizon's going to be broken by this, and we know lots of people depend on Horizon, so it's part of the ecosystem.
But that's not, that can't be a rule, right? I mean, if we like when we fix the bucket list or whatever, like that, you don't need a SEP always, but like, when you're adding a new feature, like it generally is going to make sense to have a SEP involved.
Well, maybe it's a question that you have to answer. Does this require a SEP? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, that's fine. But if it does,
maybe there's like an explicit link. Like, so maybe one of the header fields should be like associated SEPs. Maybe there's multiple ones, right? There's a new feature that could be used in 2 different ways. So, so it's a kind of metadata thing that needs to be added. While we're on the metadata, this is kind of minor, but I mostly think this is fine. But I'd like to argue for keeping the term author instead of recommender, and maybe having a maintainer instead of an owner, just because I want to make sure that everybody who contributes to writing a cap gets appropriate credit. And the term author kind of suggests that you deserve credit for something, whereas recommender doesn't necessarily carry that same connotation.
I mean, those are names from, I guess they are from different worlds. Like the names I used were from the RACI thing, right? So, and that's a standard for.
But doesn't RACI use author? Isn't the A for author?
No.
Oh.
According to Wikipedia, it can mean several different things. One of which is acceptor, which like definitely makes no sense in this context.
What makes no sense?
Acceptor.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's all names of superheroes. Like we can try to tweak it as long as we have clear definitions on what those things means, right?
Yeah, I think just to chime in again, I think like what we're describing maybe is a little bit closer to our current process, and so I'm worried it might fall into some of the same pitfalls. Like, and maybe it's just kind of a terminology thing. Like in my experience, a SEP doesn't talk about the changes to Horizon endpoints. I've never seen that in a SEP, and I think I don't care what document it's called or exactly where it appears, but I think there needs to be a link in the cap at least, if not included directly in it, that explores changes to Horizon, changes to the SDKs, because I think that's been the issue so far, is we have a disconnection between the cap and then the implications it has downstream in the SDKs. So as long as we cover that in some kind of doc, maybe we kind of change what a SEP is to include that. That's
or we
so
create
caps,
some
link,
new
steps,
repository or some new place to store that particular kind of doc, right? Like,
yeah.
like so like a cap links to a SEP and a SEP links to like a a Horizon working document or something, whatever we call it.
Yeah, I want to be clear
No,
that
but
like I support this. I just want to make it clear that like we may not find all this stuff at the right time, right? It's good to think about it at some level, but like the fee change was very subtle. It's one line in a piece of XDR that you have to notice and then realize that actually that's implemented with an int32 in Horizon, and then there's all these consequences. We are not going to get all the things, so I wouldn't want to like gate the cap on.
Right, and the only way we get those is if we like release some proto version of core, and then had a long time to implement all the Horizon changes and discover them, right? Which was
exactly
really slow.
In the same way that the cap evolves as core does their implementation. Some of the gotchas will become visible as you think through the implementation in the SDKs or Horizon. And I don't know that there's much.
Sure, yeah,
I mean,
but like
we could do something, but
yeah, and my point was, I think this due diligence has to happen before the cap gets into the final state.
Even if you miss some stuff, I mean.
No, but like the point is that to what Eric was saying, for example, oh, there is that change. People have to actually go through every change, think about every change, because that's how we do write the cap. We have to actually think about, in detail, what does it mean to make that change in core, right?
Right.
I think we have to do the same thing for the other systems.
I feel like part of the surprise with the fee change, with the change in columns in the Horizon was just how long it took, right? Like, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it was hard to know until you started doing it. Like, oh man, that copying and pasting, like basically creating these two new columns is going to take forever. And like,
okay, yeah. So, well, that's more of a lesson learned, I guess. But like in general, right? It's more like we should be like maybe we would not have identified this fee change until much later. It's more about the pattern, right? That we should be able to basically think about, like, oh, there's this schema change coming, and maybe we don't understand exactly like the implication, but we know there is this specific schema change.
yeah.
And then hopefully, the more eyes we get on that thing, people, remember, oh, when you make this kind of change, you're going to take a hit.
yeah, I mean, I definitely support this. I support doing some due diligence up front and trying to think it through at a point where we can still make changes in the cap. That seems like a no-brainer to me. I'm just saying, to understand all of the implications is very difficult, and we're not going to sit down and think really hard and figure that out. We're going to have to do it.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. And just to be sure, Eric, do you like the idea of listing out the changes to the Horizon API, for example, before finalizing the cap?
I like at least some kind of summary that says what we think the impact is at a high level. I just don't know how detailed that can get, but we'll try our best and see what happens. Now, the other related thing to this is it says representative group of stakeholders, which is, I guess, intentionally vague. And so we have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of thinking about the consequences for something like Horizon and then forgetting something else, like maybe the consequences for hardware wallets, for example.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's the reason it's vague is because basically there is when the working group is kind of forming, it should actually decide who are the members, right?
I also think
like
that those members might change over time. That's something I've been thinking this whole time, where it's like at the beginning, you need people who know how core works, plus some people who have like a reason to motivate this thing. And then as the core part of it develops and it's like, oh, okay, like we have these ideas for how we could do things, like let's make sure we're like none of these are offensive to Horizon or offensive to hardware wallets. And then you start roping those people in and you got a different set of voices.
So everybody gets to spend a day with John.
What a present for everybody.
Okay, I mean, obviously this needs thought and work, but I think the issue kind of kicked it off, and we can talk about it more. I don't know that we're going to come to any greater conclusion after this. I mean, it seems like we could talk about this on the dev mailing list, and eventually I feel like we need to update the README on the CAP thing, and probably like the actual template for CAPs too, and work on working groups. We should have a working group to work on working groups.
Maybe a way forward is everybody can comment on this issue that Nico's raised, and we can iterate a little bit, because as he says, it's not the we're not saying this is the diff, we're saying here's a starting point, so we should have this discussion. Great,
perfect. So we'll start the conversation there, which is issue 624 in the protocol repo. Cool. I'm just going to take 1 minute and say that, you know, obviously we're part of the way through. All of this impacts what the upgrade process. Protocol 13, you know, we delayed the vote for 2 weeks, and I think we've learned a lot about just better notification. So I think, you know, the basic idea, which I've posted, is to work out the timeline for Horizon and SDK readiness, and I think these working groups will help do that. Then to post an upgrade guide that tells everyone what to do and where to find stuff. Message all the relevant channels, and then to verify that key projects in the ecosystem are ready, basically get them to write back to us and say, we are ready to upgrade. Then I think do the testnet upgrade, then coordinate for the public net upgrade. And then once an upgrade happens, we post an upgrade notice with all the errors and any information about how to use the new features. So it's like all concise. And that's, again, just a proposal that we did most of that with Protocol 13, but we didn't reach out specifically to key organizations until later in the process. And it's getting somewhat better, but I'm open to any suggestions that anyone ever has about how to improve the process.
Who's a key organization? Do we have like a mailing list of key organizations or something?
I have a list of yeah.
Is it anyone can join? Like
I notify, like places where anyone can join, which are all of our public channels, are notified out the wazoo, right? So like they get first notification, they get notification every time that there's an update and a week in advance. So any place where people opt in, like, but we also need to reach out to people who will not opt into our own channels. Like, so specifically what delayed this protocol release is like making sure that crypto exchanges where, you know, they deal with a lot of different networks and Stellar isn't first and foremost in their minds, it's hard to get their attention or to get them to opt into a channel. So yes, anyone can opt in and we can check readiness for anyone who's opted in, but we also need to do some bespoke outreach to people who are difficult to get to opt in. That's the basic idea. Okay, radical. So that's the end of our first broadcasted Stellar Protocol meeting. How's everybody feel?